No, not that I've ever really needed one. This thing blows up, it'll be a real short class. So you have a new face up here for a while. So, do we have anyone that needs some special prayers? Would you be so kind as to... My time. Prayers for Courtney as she starts her new job at Harding. Isn't that going to be tough for you to get back to here on Sunday mornings? Then why'd you take the job? We're going to start Isaiah this morning. And in my typical fashion, we're going to start it a little different. Who can tell me what John 3:16 says? For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son. I don't think we have any idea what that passage really means. I don't think we have a clue of hoping to understand what that passage really means. But I want to use that as the central kind of theme for you to keep in the back of your mind as we go through Isaiah. And hopefully you'll see the connection as we go through this. Can I get a little help passing these around? As Wade went through his study of the minor prophets, several things occurred to me. And Wade talked a lot about how so many of these minor prophets were contemporaries of each other. So that provoked me to put this thing together. Now, there's a good chance that my lines aren't perfect. But the point is not whether they're exact down to the year. The point is to give you a picture of what's going on in the Old Testament through the prophets. I didn't attempt to get all of the prophets. What I did was I took the major ones and I took the books and put those on here. And so you can see how God's timeline kind of stacks up. And you'll actually find Isaiah, if you look there, I've got stars on it, in the earlier part of the prophets. First place I want to go, though, if you'll see all the way over on the left of my map there, and at the 1400, or 1450, 1500, that's where Joshua was. Somewhere around in that time frame, heading backwards. So that's where I want to start. So if you all turn to Joshua 23, beginning in verse 6. Be very firm then to keep and do all that is written in the book of the law of Moses, so that you may not turn aside from it to the right hand or to the left, in order that you may not associate with these nations, these which remain among you, or mention the name of their gods, or make anyone swear by them, or serve them, or bow down to them. But you are to cling to the Lord your God, as you have done to this day. For the Lord has driven out great and strong nations from before you, and as for you, no man has stood before you to this day. One of your men puts to flight 1,000, for the Lord your God is he who fights for you, just as he promised you. So take diligent heed to yourselves to love the Lord your God. For if you ever go back and cling to the rest of these nations, these which remain among you, and intermarry with them, so that you associate with them and they with you, know with certainty that the Lord your God will not continue to drive these nations out from before you, but they shall be a snare and a trap to you, and a whip on your sides, and a thorn in your eyes, until you perish off this good land which the Lord your God has given you. Now, behold, today I am going the way of all of the earth, and you know in all of your hearts and in all of your souls that not one word of all the good words which the Lord your God spake concerning you has failed. All have been fulfilled for you. Not one of them has failed. And it shall come about that just as all the good words which the Lord your God spoke to you have come upon you, so the Lord will bring upon you all the threats until he has destroyed you from off this good land which the Lord your God has given you. When you transgress the covenant of the Lord your God, which he commanded you, and go and serve other gods and bow down to them, then the anger of the Lord will burn against you, and you shall perish quickly from off this good land which he has given you. I want to start there because I think that's where the message of all of the prophets really begins. It is Joshua 23, 6 through 16. And so when you start with there and you look at this timeline, you see a period of time where the patriarchs were governing, directing the nation of Israel. And it was being overseen by the judges. And the people clamored. Now, they didn't do a good job. Neither the patriarchs, none of that era did a real good job. They were very loose association and accomplished very little and paid attention to God's commands very little. And so they clamored for a king, and then that's when you see this period of the kings start with Saul, David, Solomon, and then the other kings. And I didn't go through and identify every single one of them individually. I just have the timeline that's in there. And almost as soon as we get past Solomon and we get into the period of the other kings, you see the prophets start to arrive. And the prophets are as a whole, are doing what? They're telling the people to come back to God, that God will punish them if they don't. And you see this all through this period. And all of that ties back to what Joshua told them hundreds of years before. When he told them, pay attention, serve God. If you don't, God will punish you. And so all of this is this very slow build-up. And then you see my line that's drawn here at 400 BC, where God basically says, enough. Enough. And then what happens is the way is prepared for Christ. Isaiah is called a messianic prophet because he is quoted more in the New Testament than any other of the old prophets. And his entire book, almost his entire book, is aimed at predicting the deliverance of Israel. Isaiah believed it was the actual nation of Israel, but the deliverance of the remnant, that Israel would provide the way for the whole world, which they did. So I wanted to touch bases on that because I wanted to give you some real broad strokes. Because as we get down into this, the time that Wade spent, hopefully you'll be able to put that on top of this and begin to understand all of this that's going on. So, anybody have any questions or comments before we get past that? Okay. Here's something for those of you that like the stuff. There are 66 chapters in Isaiah. What else is there 66 of? 66 books in the Bible. Does that mean anything? Probably not. Just a one of the many things of numerology that we can look at and we can be amused at. We can try to, some people want to try to apply some real meaning to it. I thought it was an interesting coincidence. So, okay. Isaiah lived approximately 780 to 695 AD. Again, approximates. When you go searching Sometimes you can find information that will identify the time that a prophet was active. You can find it either in their writings, in their references to kings, in their other references to historical things. But to find their actual lifespan is very, very difficult. So that's why I say approximately. I'm figuring most of the time when I put this on here, the prophets were 30 or 40 years old when they started. Unless something identifies specifically their death, they probably lived another 10 or 15 years. And so that's how I came up with these timelines. Isaiah's death is relatively easy to find. And we'll get to that in a minute. So Isaiah was a prophet from the southern kingdom, Judah, during the time that the northern kingdom was being taken into captivity, being destroyed by the Assyrians. Isaiah lived through the reigns of 5 kings: Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, Hezekiah, and Manasseh. A lot of the scholars think, though, that some of his visions may have occurred earlier in his life and he just held on to them, maybe didn't understand them, didn't know their application until it came to fruition and he began to pen his book. There is a tradition in the Talmud. Who knows what the Talmud is? I'm impressed. I had to look it up. I had no idea what the Talmud was. The Talmud, according to Smith's Bible Dictionary, for the rest of you that don't know what it is either, it is from the Hebrew word to learn. It's a large collection of writings containing a full account of the civil and religious laws of the Jews. It was a fundamental principle of the Pharisees, common to them with all Orthodox modern Jews, that by the side of the written law, regarded as the summary of the principles and general laws of the Hebrew people, there was an oral law to complete and to explain the written law. It was an article of faith that in the Pentateuch there was no precept and no regulation, ceremonial, doctrinal, or legal, of which God had not given to Moses all explanations necessary for their application with the order to transmit them by word of mouth. The classical subject is the following in the Mishnah on this wing. Moses received the oral law from the Sinai and delivered it to Joshua, and Joshua to the elders, and the elders to the prophets, and the prophets to the men of the great synagogue. This oral law, with the numerous commentaries upon it, forms the Talmud, and it consists of 2 parts, the Mishnah and a Gemara. The Mishnah, I know this is a lot of stuff, just kind of try to glean what you think sounds interesting and just ignore me for the rest of it. The Mishnah, or second law, which contains a compendium of the whole ritual law, was reduced to writing in its present form by a rabbi, a Jew of great wealth and influence, who flourished in the 2nd century AD. Viewed as a whole, the precepts in the Mishnah treated men like children, formalizing and defining the minutest particulars of ritual observances. The expression of bondage or weak and beggarly elements and of burdens too heavy for men to bear faithfully represent the impression produced by their multiplicity. The Mishnah is very concisely written and requires notes. It's so nice when these guys write stuff for people and they use language that most people don't ever use in their lifetime. So this circumstance led to the commentaries called the Gemara, or a supplement, which form the second part of the Talmud, and which are very commonly meant when the word Talmud is used by itself. There are 2 Gemaras, one of Jerusalem, which is said there to be no passage which can be proved later than the first half of the 4th century, and the other of Babylon, completed about 500 AD. The latter is more important and by far the longer. Okay, I'm going through a lot of this because I'm setting the stage for what we're going to see. And when we think in terms of the Jewish nation as a whole, and a lot of which Wade covered through his studies, is how they hung very tightly to checklists. Well, this is where you see some of this concept being formed, is through this Talmud and the development of the Talmud as to why the Jews believed they had a checklist, as opposed to when Christ talked to the rich ruler and gave him broad strokes and told him about a lifestyle change, not about a checklist. And that's really what that conversation comes down to. So that's why I'm laying all of this out, because I want you to understand the foundations for all of these things. and where it ends up applying to us, that we don't fall into some of these same traps. Did you have your hand up? Wait. I didn't know if you're brushing your hair or if you had your hand up. Okay. Jewish tradition has it that Isaiah was slain by Manasseh in 695 AD, and that's where we find the end of his life. It says that Isaiah refused Manasseh's idolatrous decrees. He was fastened between two planks and cut in half lengthwise. Now, they didn't have Stanley Black & Decker saws, so these would have been a wooden saw. This would have been a very painful and very gruesome death. What's interesting, though, is we find this referenced in the New Testament. Y'all turn with me to one of everybody, I'm sure's favorite chapters, Hebrews 11. We're going to pick up at verse 32. And what more shall I say? I do not have time to tell about Gideon, Barak, Samson, and Jephthah, about David and Samuel and the prophets, who through faith conquered kingdoms, administered justice, and gained what was promised, who shut the mouths of lions, quenched the fury of the flames, and escaped the edge of the sword, whose weakness was turned to strength, and who became powerful in battle and routed foreign armies. Women received back their dead, raised to life again. There were others who were tortured, refusing to be released so that they might gain an even better resurrection. Some faced jeers and flogging, and even chains and imprisonment. They were put to death by stoning. They were sawed in two. They were killed by the sword. They went about in sheepskin and goatskin, destitute, persecuted, and mistreated. The world was not worthy of them. A lot of the scholars believe that reference of being sawn in two goes right straight back to Isaiah. Again, just one of those colors that when we read through these things and we're encouraged and impressed by the writing, there are real people behind this. And so that's why I bring this out, that in all likelihood, Isaiah is the one that they were referring to there with being sawn in two. And I'm sure there were others. Sometimes when we read through and we look at Daniel, for example, who served in the court of the Pharaoh, and we say, yes, it's God's providence that Daniel was there. Yes, it was. But there's a whole lot more back there that's human, that is in place because of God's providence. Tradition has it that Isaiah's father was Amos, not the prophet, but a brother of King Amaziah. This would make him first cousin to Uzziah, grandson of King Joash, and royal blood, and very familiar with the palace. So when we get into this and we see where Isaiah is dealing with the kings directly, it's because he's a relative. There is an excellent chance that he is directly from the line of David. Okay, and so that gives him a special place in there. So it's God's providence that these men are here, but they're able to do God's work because of other things that have been in place, because they are of royal lineage, because they are special people in that culture. Okay? Again, these are colors that a lot of times we don't consider. What was the world like during Isaiah's time? I'm going to do something I usually don't do. I'm going to specifically read from Halley's Bible Handbook, only because it's historical. For 150 years before the days of Isaiah, the Assyrian Empire had been expanding. As early as 840 BC, Israel under Jehu had begun to pay tribute to Assyria. While Isaiah was a young man, around 734 BC, Assyria carried away all of North Israel. 13 years later, Samaria fell and the rest of Israel was carried away. Then a few years later, the Assyrians came onto Judah, destroyed 46 walled cities. Okay, let me stop a second here. We think of Judah as a city, but when you look at this, Judah was a series of cities and stalwarts and strongholds, all centered around protecting the king. Okay, and so that's where this comes from. 46 walled cities and carried away 200,000 captives. Finally, in 701, when Isaiah was an old man, the Assyrians were stopped before the walls of Jerusalem by an angel of God. Thus Isaiah's whole life was spent under the shadow of threatening Assyrian power, and he himself witnessed the ruin of his entire nation at their hands, except Jerusalem. Okay, I want a couple notes in here. You'll notice that Halley says 701, the Assyrians were stopped at Jerusalem. And then we find the history says that Isaiah was put to death in 695. So in a period of 6 years, the kings were so arrogant, were so narcissistic, were so self-absorbed that they had forgotten that God just stopped the Assyrian army 6 years earlier and put Isaiah to death for refusing to engage in idolatrous actions. 6 years. That's scary. For those in my generation, we grew up under the threat of communism. Okay. If you're in your somewhere between mid-60s and mid-70s, when you were in grade school, you crawled underneath the table when you put the paper up on the vents in the classrooms for nuclear bomb drills. Interesting waste of time looking back, but you remember that, doing that too? So when it talks about Isaiah living his whole life under the threat of the Assyrians, there's a good number of us that should be able to relate to that mindset. Now, obviously the threats were different. They came with different weapons. They came in different ways. But nonetheless, it was just as insidious. And so that's how Isaiah spends his whole life, is being part of the royal family, the royal lineage, that is constantly looking over their shoulder for this huge, ugly army of Assyrians to come rolling down and take care of them. And imagine Isaiah sitting back going, man, God's been warning you. God's been warning you. Or all of these other, when you look at this timeline, all of these other prophets that are right there in that same timeline. God's been warning you. God's been warning you. And it all goes back to Joshua's warning. That's where it started. Okay, as I mentioned earlier, Isaiah is referred to as the Messianic prophet. He was completely given over to the concept that his nation was to be a Messianic nation to the world, believing that the whole world would be blessed through the Jewish nation. He is quoted more often in the New Testament than any other Old Testament prophet. Let's go to John 12, starting in verse 39. For this reason, they could not believe, because as Isaiah says elsewhere, he has blinded their eyes and hardened their hearts, so they can neither see with their eyes, nor understand with their hearts, nor turn, and I would heal them. Isaiah said this because he saw Jesus' glory and spoke about him. There's some other really interesting things about the book of Isaiah. And I'm again going to read from Halley's book on archaeology, again, because Halley does a good job of dealing with facts. In my opinion, Halley does not do a good job of understanding the scriptures. And so that's the difference. Sargon. In Isaiah 20, it is said, Sargon, king of Assyria, sent Tartan and fought against Ashdod and took it. This is the only known mention of Sargon's name in extant ancient literature. Thus, mentioning the name of a king never known to have existed, the critics had said was one of the Bible's blunders. But in 1842, Bada discovered the ruins of Sargon's palace in Khorsabad on the north edge of Nineveh with treasures and inscriptions showing him to have been one of Assyria's greatest kings. Yet his name had disappeared from history, save this lone mention in Isaiah, till Bada's discovery. In recent years, the ruins of Sargon's palace have been excavated by the Oriental Institute. From inscriptions, it's learned that Shalmaneser died while besieging Samaria and that he was succeeded by Sargon, who completed the capture. Furthermore, verifying the statement above quoted from Isaiah 21, an inscription of Sargon says, Azuri, king of Ashdod, planned in his heart not to pay tribute. In my anger, I marched against Ashdod with my usual bodyguard. I conquered Ashdod and Gath. I took their treasures and their people. I settled them from the lands of the east. I took tribute from Philistia, Judah, Edom, and Moab. Okay. And that's not the archaeological note I really wanted to read. But we're going to get into some other things about that it's unique about Isaiah, but that's another one of those things that, again, I want you to just kind of keep in the back of your mind. It's not something that I would think that you'd bring up at dinner tonight to discuss, but it's good to have the background information, in my opinion. The Isaiah scroll. All original copies of Bible books, as far as is known, have been lost. Our Bible is made from copies of copies, as we all know. Until the invention of printing, these copies were made by hand. Old Testament books were written in Hebrew, New Testament books were written in Greek. The oldest known extant complete Bible manuscripts date from the 4th and 5th centuries. They are in Greek, containing the Old Testament, the Septuagint, which was a Greek translation of the Hebrew Old Testament made in 2nd century. The oldest known existing Hebrew manuscripts of Old Testament books were made about AD 900. On these based is what is called the Masoretic text of the Hebrew Old Testament, from which our English translations have been made. 1947 at Ain Fashka, about 7 miles south of Jericho, 1 mile east of the Dead Sea, some wandering Arab Bedouins carrying goods from the Jordan Valley to Bethlehem, searching for a lost goat in a wadi that empties into the Dead Sea, came upon a partially collapsed cave in which they found a number of crushed jars with protruding ends of scrolls. The Bedouins pulled out the scrolls, took them along, and passed them on to St. Mark's Syrian Orthodox convent in Jerusalem, who turned them over to the American Schools of Oriental Research. One of these scrolls was identified as the Book of Isaiah, written 2,000 years ago, 1,000 years older than any known manuscript of any Hebrew Old Testament book. It is a roll written on parchment about 24 feet long, made up of sheets 10 by 15 sewed together in script of ancient Hebrew, which was evidence it was made in the 2nd century BC. This is where, to me, it gets really interesting. This and other scrolls had originally been sealed in earthenware jars and were part of a Jewish library which had been hidden in an isolated cave in the time of danger, perhaps in the Roman conquest of Judah. Essentially, it is the exact same book as the book of Isaiah in our Bible. So if you ever have any doubts about the time frame and the translations and the rewritings and the copies, we need only look to Isaiah to find a text that dates back to the lifetime of Isaiah that is virtually identical to what's in front of you this morning. Talk about the providence of God. The actual book of Isaiah is interesting. There are a lot of old commentators that want to break it down and categorize it and classify it. And in dealing with Clark, which I happen to be blessed to have his 3-book set. He talks about a couple of them that they both break it down into historical and prophetical. And it's the Tringa and Calmet for you guys that are interested in that depth of history. Isaiah is structured where you have prophetical for 35 chapters, and then you have 4 or 5 chapters in the middle that deal with history. And then it goes back to prophetical for the balance of the book. They all agree that the history portion deals with Isaiah's time, basically. And then the prophetical in these other 2 sections, the older section is dealing with his visions that he's seen about what's to come, and the later visions are dealing with Christ. That's just real broad strokes. Clark was interesting in that he said, you know what, that doesn't make as much sense as these guys thought it did. Clark was unwilling to put that kind of categorization on Isaiah's writings. It is obvious, and we'll see it in that break in there in the middle of those historical chapters. But as far as breaking the prophetical chapters down into nice, neat categories, unfortunately for y'all, that's not going to happen, because that way I can't teach it by these nice, neat little categories. So it's going to be an interesting study. Anybody have any questions or comments? Yes, ma'am. Hopefully we'll be able to see that as we get through there. As I glean upon those much wiser and much more studied than myself to find those things in there. And hopefully I'll be able to relay that to you. I thought it was interesting that all of the commentators that I have looked at do hold that general structure. They just differ on how the other parts should be broken down. So, yeah. And they no doubt do. David. Yep. 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 Yeah. Yep. Absolutely. Absolutely. A lot of times we're very critical of the Jews, and I happen to be one. But in the defense of these scrolls, there was nobody but people writing stuff down for this whole time frame up until the beginning of the printing press. So you have the words of Joshua from 1250 BC, Isaiah from 700 BC, that have been found virtually identical. Okay. So the Jews were really good about transcribing accurately what was handed down to them. And we see that. And again, no question, God's influence, God's inspiration is what's behind this. But for us to be able to have that physical proof of our faith, that should be incredibly encouraging. Mm-hmm. That was when they were declared a nation, right? Okay, so they were actually there a few years earlier, more or less in control, and of course they're dating this as 1947, so yeah. Yeah, all of that timing is past amazing. Yep, no doubt. Any other comments? We've only got a couple minutes, and I hesitate to really break into the book itself. Um, Anybody have anything they want to add? Clayton? Anybody? Yes, ma'am. Sargon? Spelled, it's Sargon. The importance is that he was an Assyrian king until the ruins were discovered. The only mention of his name was in the book of Isaiah. And so it was used, like David was talking about with the atheists, it was used as leverage to disprove the Bible, saying the Bible had errors in it because this king never existed. And then, oops, archaeology found him. Did you get one of my timelines? Okay. If you look dead center in the page, you'll see one with asterisks underneath it, kind of. There's Isaiah, right there in the middle. Yeah. That turned out to be a whole lot more work than I expected it to be when I did it, too. Tommy, would you be so kind as to close?